Yeah, it is my pleasure to speak with you folks. A little bit about who I am. I was a Fulbright scholar in Vietnam, so I was served in Vietnam for had a relatively long visit there and taught in the university in Vietnam. I worked with the Department of State. I had several contracts with the Department of State, both working in China, where I worked with American Cultural Centers in China, which was kind of the counter side to Confucius Centers that we have in China. This was the American version in China. And I also did some work in Indonesia with the Department of State, where we did a tour of the country, and I spoke at many of their universities talking about the American system of higher education. I'm an international education researcher, have published about 15 articles or chapters on international education. My other specialty is American community colleges. So that has been my career. There you see me in Vietnam, where I worked with the Southeastern Asian Ministry of Education and working on programs to not just only bring students to America, but we worked on English language programs and a lot of other programs to update education in Vietnam. I wanted to, also here I am in China. And where I am here in China is I'm working with agents, educational agents. Now, this is the whole topic in and of itself. But I was working on behalf of ISU as well as the U.S. Department of State. Education agent is kind of like, well, if you think about a real estate agent, if you want to sell your house, you could do it on your own, or you can have an agent help you with that sale. Education agents are people who the university contracts with to help find additional students to come to that university. And it's a whole field. And there I am working with that group. And I wanted to point out the young woman at the end there. Was my graduate student at the time when we were out there. And she's from China, and I brought her with me to help me work on these as a translator and other things. And what happened with her is what you hope happens with international students. She came, she got her PhD at Iowa State, and is now a professor of higher education, kind of looking at the same issues that I do. And she's a full professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. So, these are why we really want to embrace international students, because these are the people who are going to come to our country, hopefully stay, and hold positions of leadership, high-level, highly educated individuals. All right, so let's start by diving into some numbers. Statistics of international students in the U.S. Okay, so I want to point out some numbers here. International students account for about between 5 and 6% of all students across the country. Looking at some of these numbers, starting with 2022-23, because that was the beginning of the recovery after COVID. And there were 1,057,000 international students across the country. In 23-24, and in 2022-23, that was a large increase, 11.5% increase in the number of students. The following year, we also had an increase for the 2023-2024. Last year, 2024-25, there was a big increase in the number of international students. The numbers are not completely in. All of the numbers will be finalized in November. But at this point, the projected number of international students on American campuses today is about 1,800,000, which represents a 15% decrease in the number of students. We're going to talk about why, but I want you to think about that number, because what that represents is not necessarily the number of students that are coming. It's the total number that are here. So to get that big of a decrease, that means that there's a lot fewer coming. because students that were already here, that are sophomores, juniors, seniors, continuing graduate students, are in that number as well. Okay, so yes, fall 2025, a dramatic decrease in international enrollment. And that number represents about a 30 to 40% drop in the number of new students coming. A 15% drop, as I said earlier, in overall international student enrollment. But where that number really declines is how many new students are able to get in. Of course, students that are already here, some of them are having problems too, because if they go home, for whatever reason, it may be difficult to come back. Many are just not doing that. They're just staying put until they get their degree. The numbers also include not just actively enrolled students, but also those that are on what we call OPT, which is optional professional training. Optional professional training, I'll talk about that later, but that includes additional programs that international students can do after they graduate to get additional training before they go home. And they're still considered international students while they do that. They're on the same F1 visa. Okay, why? What's happening? Why do we see these declines? Well, big issue. There was a pause in student visa interviews between May 27th and June 18th. What that means is every international student, with the rare exception of some Canadians and students from Bermuda, but every other international student across the country must have a visa, a student visa, to come. And to get that, they have to go to the American embassy in their country and get the appropriate forms. I'll be talking about those forms tonight. But when they stopped it between May 27th and June 18th, that was a peak activity time for students wanting to come for the fall semester. Those interviews have begun again, but there's fewer of them. There was limited, when it began again, when that availability became a part of the embassy scheduling, the number of appointments has been reduced from previous time. So there is limited visa appointment in key sending countries like India, China, Nigeria, Japan, and others. And these are the countries that send the most students. There's also a new social media vetting protocol. This is brand new. So when students apply for a visa, the Department of State and even the FBI can do additional background checks going through their social media accounts. I'll talk about that a little more later too. In addition to that, there are immigration policy changes. There are travel restrictions in 19 countries, and others are on the slate for inclusion in that as well. And approximately 6,000 international students that were already here, who already had their visas approved, have had their visas revoked. Here's some numbers to kind of answer the question, where are all these students coming from? Where are the million students coming from? Well, more than half are coming from India and China alone. India and China alone count for 54% of all international students. So you can see the countries that are sending students to America. China used to be the #1 sending country. India has now surpassed China as the #1. And we'll see that again when I show you some numbers from Iowa State and the University of Iowa. That pattern continues. Here's Iowa State numbers. These were updated yesterday. So, fall of 2025, this semester, 2,823 students at Iowa State, representing 9% of the more than 31,000 students at Iowa State. Now, 9%, if you recall, I mentioned that across the country, international students make up between 5 and 6% of all students. Iowa State has 9%. So Iowa State is actually a university that welcomes a lot of international students, and in some ways even surprisingly so. It follows the same pattern as the rest of the country, with India being the #1 and China being #2. It is a big jump for Iowa State in the number of Indian students. Again, China used to be the #1 by far, and now India has far surpassed that. If we look at the historical trend, 2016, which was pre-pandemic, there were about 3,200 international students. 2020, we all know that year, it dropped significantly. By 2024, it had rebounded to close to what it had been before. But if you look at that number and compare it to right now, you see that it's slightly less, but not much. So ISU really hasn't seen a significant dip in international students this year. And I think that is because of the number of students from India has just really blossomed, has really gotten much, much larger. If you're interested in the difference between undergrad and grad, again, this is still ISU, you can see that the majority of international students are graduate or professional students. Undergraduates make up much less. You can see the first year, sophomore, junior, senior, non-degree, the numbers as they stand. So these specific numbers are 2024 numbers. The breakdown by first year, second year isn't available yet. University of Iowa, what does that look like? University of Iowa hosts 2,084 international students from 90 countries, representing 6.5% of the total student body. And remember, ISU was 9%. So ISU is really a bigger player in the international student arena. And here's the numbers again. You see it's a little different. China still predominates at the University of Iowa, and India is second. Maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised at how much fewer international students were at the University of Iowa than ISU. But one of the reasons is the programs that they offer. If I have UNI fans here, I thought I would include them because that's of interest. And UNI does have international students. They host they host 202 international students from 47 countries, representing 2.2% of their student body of 9,283 students. So they're a player. But this one's a surprise, I think. Grinnell. If you're in international education, Grinnell is a very common college to learn about because Grinnell makes international students one of their policies. They have 70 international students, but that represents, it's a small college, 20% of their student body. So Grinnell is a big player in international students. One of the reasons is they have a special program called Friends of International Students that connects students with local host families. So it's a much more personalized situation. Each international student has someone to whom they can talk with, get some support. And they also offer financial aid for international students to meet, according to them, their full demonstrated need. And so Grinnell is unique in that policy. Boston College does something similar, but Grinnell's a liberal arts college. And so they don't have a lot of the scientific or heavy scientific and engineering and those types of programs. So it attracts a certain type of individual. But Grinnell's a major player in the international student arena. So, okay, we talked about ISU, we talked about all of the Iowa colleges. Where are students international, where do international students go? I have on the screen the top 10 institutions and their enrollment for international students. Those in red are private institutions. Those in black are public. If you look at the first four, they're all private institutions. 3 of the 4 are on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast. They're all Ivy League institutions. Most international students, or a good portion of them, their dream institution is one of the Ivy Leagues. International students tend to target private institutions over public ones for a couple of reasons. But one is that private institutions offer the same tuition. It's high, but it's the same for domestic students and international students. It's one cost. Doesn't matter what state you come from, what country you come from, this is the cost. And so some international people may feel that that is more fair than going to a public institution where you pay a premium. Domestic students pay less. I'll have some numbers to share with you a little later. But you see, number 1 is NYU, New York University, with 27,247, and you can go down the line. University of Southern California, which is 4th. I served at University of Southern California for 10 years and worked with their international programs. And they welcome a lot of students at the University of Southern California. And many of their programs, or I shouldn't say many, several of their programs at the university are so heavily enrolled with international students that if that tide were to stop, the program would have to be eliminated.
So that is a private?
Yes, University of Southern California is private, yes. Yes. In the publics in California are the university system, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of California at San Diego, or the other university systems in California, but University of Southern California is private. All right, so I said earlier, well, we looked earlier, and we saw that there are more students going to ISU, and I said, well, it's the programs. So here's the programs that are the most popular undergraduate majors and popular graduate majors or programs for international students at ISU. Computer science, mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, you see all of these. And these are where the majority of students at ISU, the international students, are enrolled in. They come here specifically for those programs. So, impact of immigration policy. We talked about we looked at the numbers. What's the impact of these changes that we're seeing? Well, the main change is that the U.S. loses its reputation as an attractive destination. Whenever I traveled abroad, I never met a student who said, I don't want to come to the U.S. You know, the U.S. was always the #1 place where they wanted to go. You know, the U.S. higher education system has often been seen as the jewel of all systems. Some of that sparkle on that jewel is beginning to rub off, as well as additional competitors, other countries that are increasing their invitations, their recruitment, and their numbers. So some of the immigration policy, the stricter U.S. immigration policy have really created uncertainty and reduced the sense of welcome. We don't seem to be as welcoming as we used to be. There are new limits now on visa durations, on how long people can stay. There is definitely increased vetting of looking into backgrounds. There have been frequent and sudden changes. There are stories and articles about revoking student visas for what some may consider minor infractions. There is a restricting of post-graduation work opportunities. Again, I'm going to say almost all of my graduate students, my international graduate students, once they got here, they didn't want to go back. The hope was to stay, to get their degree and stay. Many of them came and said, oh no, I'm going to go back, but give it a year or two. And they changed their mind when they saw what America could offer. But if there aren't any jobs, they're going to have to go back. The pausing and limiting of visa appointments, of course, that's one of the helping us lose our reputation. And the results, of course, we're seeing are fewer enrollments, less campus diversity, and losses for local economies that rely on student spending and their contributions. So let's take a little deeper dive into the U.S. immigration system. There are immigrant visas. Immigrant visas are for permanent residents or for bringing family in or being able to work here permanently. And then there's non-immigrant visas. In the non-immigrant visas, where student visas come under that heading. Non-immigrant visas are for temporary stays with a specific purpose and duration, a start and a stop. And when students are applying for a non-immigrant visa, they must demonstrate an intent to return home when they're applying for it. There's all different kinds of categories of these types of visas, but the most common, well, there's the B versions for business and tourism. So when people come from other countries to visit, they get a B visa. There is the H classifications. There is some students who come under the H-1B visas. That's for vocational training. So if you come here to be a plumber, you come here to work in the trades, you're going to a trade school, you have an H-1B visa. J-1 is for exchange students. The F-1 visa, this is the big one. This is a full-time student coming to the U.S. for a full-time program. They have to be accepted into a program, have a place to live, and all of that to get the F-1 visa. So the F-1 visa, here are the criteria. Full-time study. They have to be accepted into a full-time program. If students come to a university and they drop some of their courses so that they're no longer full-time, they have to go back. They have to maintain their full-time enrollment. Under an F-1, you can work on campus. You can't have a job outside of the university or college, but you can work on campus. And you can also have optical practical training if you can find that position that fits the program and your degree. If international students are bringing family members with them, a spouse or children, everybody has to have a visa. The spouse and children have F-2 visas. The spouses cannot work or study full-time. So when a trailing spouse comes, Often the spouse may be enrolled in maybe some English learning or something like that at the community college or through churches or whatever, but they can't be in a degree program while they're here on an F2 visa. If anything happens to the F1 holder, then they have to go back as well. F3 is for places like Mexico or Canada where students live in those border countries and come over the border just for education. So the F category, F1 specifically for full-time university students. I've talked a little bit about this OPT. It's important because this is something that can really expand a student's education as well as their opportunities to find a job. It's that it usually stands between graduating and a job here in the US. So it's temporary employment. They have to apply for it. It extends their visa 12 to 36 months, depending on the program. And it has to be applicable to their program. So if you're an electronic engineer, you have to have a position that is working in that field. You can't just find any position. Some of them are paid, some of them aren't. This certainly contributes to retaining global talent. And there is pre-OPT and there's post-OPT. But it is it's competitive. Students look for these positions and they maintain their F1 visa post-graduation while they're on OPT. The goal often is that the company that is giving them this opportunity of optional professional training will then sponsor them for a permanent visa to get a job that they can stay permanently. That's usually a very big goal. But regardless, it certainly is beneficial to these international students. How do international students come? It's not easy, and it's not cheap. And let me walk you through the process. Okay, the first step is to find a program that you want. In order to enroll, you have to meet minimum admission requirements. You have to have certain tests. I'll talk about that. That is the first step. The second step is preparing the documents. You have to have all your academic transcripts, and they have to be translated. It's not just translated into English, but it's translated into the American grading system. You know, we have A, B, C's, and D's, or a four-point grading process. Many other countries don't do that. They have different numbers. So that is often difficult, and they have to pay to have their transcripts translated. They have to have an English proficiency test, unless they come from an English-speaking country. They often have to have standardized test scores, like the ACT, the SAT, or the GMAT. These tests are not offered everywhere. They're not hard to get here, but in China, in Iran, Sudan, and some other countries, they don't allow those tests to be administered. So what do students do? Well, most of my Chinese students all had to take a little side trip to Hong Kong or to Taiwan. Then think money. And often, you have to take these tests more than once. You know, American students will often take, an ACT or an SAT more than once. But international students often take them much more often will they have to take them more than once, especially the English ones, the English proficiency tests. Many of my international students had to take those several times. It's very hard. It includes listening and reading and writing and speaking. Most international students learning English as a second language, reading and writing is not a problem. Listening and speaking are the problems. I was in Vietnam, teaching in Vietnam. Obviously, I was teaching in English, and I had to have an interpreter. But I was trying to speak with some of the other instructors, and I was speaking with the instructors who teach English in Vietnam. These are Vietnamese professors teaching English. They couldn't understand me at all. I had to write it down. They could read it perfectly, but they couldn't, they couldn't listen and hear it. That's the kind of training, English-speaking training, that many students get. So the IELTS is a real problem. Okay, they have to have a valid passport. And here's another clincher. You have to have proof of financial support. You have to be able to prove that you can live in the United States, pay your tuition, pay your housing, pay for your food. So you have to have bank accounts, or you have to have letters of support. A lot of international students are getting scholarships from their home countries and things like that. All that documentation has to be shown. What many international students do is they're pooling money from their families. When I showed you that India and China are the #2 countries, these are not rich countries, especially when you think about the exchange rates, what it costs here versus what food costs, for instance, or housing costs in their home country. So often international students will have mom and dad's support, grandma and grandpa's support, auntie and uncle, and a whole family. So putting their money together into an account to prove that the student can live here in the United States without becoming a financial burden. Next, students have to complete their applications. They have to go it online. This isn't always easy to do, but certainly possible. And of course, there is a cost to fill out any application. And just like domestic students, international students often will apply to several institutions. So that becomes an expense as well. They have to upload all their documents. And I shouldn't say it's simple, because in a lot of these countries, getting internet access is not as simple as we have it here. We all have it in our homes. A lot of Chinese and Indian and other areas, other countries, people don't have that. They have to go someplace else to get and pay to have that done. Then they wait. They've applied. What happens at Iowa State, there's a review. The reviews are on a rolling basis. And if accepted, the student will receive an official admission offer and instructions for the next steps. So great, I got admitted. I'm there. No, this is the easy part. The next part, they accept the offer. Now, ISU charges $425 when you accept the offer. All institutions have a charge. That's actually a little lower than some, but that is a cost. They've accepted the offer. They then have to submit their financial documentation to ISU. They're showing proof that they can cover tuition, living expenses for at least the first year. And ISU reviews it, confirms their ability to pay, and if all goes well, the student gets a coveted Form I-20. The I-20 is a real prize. That means you've been accepted, you're welcome, take the next steps. So they get their I-20, and now they apply for the U.S. student visa. So they've been accepted. Now it's time to apply for the visa. Another $350 fee. to SEVIS, that's the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System. They complete some more forms, and they schedule a visa interview at the nearest U.S. embassy or consulate. Now, you remember what we said earlier was that many of these appointments have been diminished. There's less of them. They were even cut off for a while. So you have to have an appointment. It has to be in person, and it has to be at the U.S. Embassy. That's not always in everyone's backyard. So again, more money and travel. If they get an interview, they go to the interview with their passport, their I-20 form that came from the university saying you've been fully accepted, their visa application proof and fee receipt that they paid everything, their financial proof showing they can live in America, the admission letter coming from the university, and bringing their academic records and test scores, their transcripts and their test scores. The interview is conducted in English, verbal, and all goes well. That's the next step. They've been accepted. Great. Now you have to arrange housing and register for orientation at ISU. And then come on over. Book their travel. International students can come up to 30 days before the program and complete all their necessary check-in, and they're all set. I should go back to housing, though, because housing isn't always that simple. Imagine arranging housing in another country. It's not always easy. The International Students and Scholars Office at ISU is excellent in helping students, but that doesn't mean that it always comes out smoothly. I have been involved in many situations with international students that were placed in these apartments or these, like in Frederickson, where they have 4 bedrooms and a kitchen, so they're sharing an area with other students. Mixing international students with domestic students doesn't always come out as well as you would like. Now, mixing domestic students, doesn't always come out well either, right? Students cannot get along. But when you add differences in living styles, differences in cooking, differences in food, differences in religion, there can be some interesting situations that accrue. I had one student, she was a sweet little Muslim girl, and she was in one of these apartments, and her domestic roommates wanted to have big parties. They were party girls. And, would bring a lot of other people, and some spend the night. You get the picture. A young woman just didn't feel comfortable and slept outside. Went out, slept outside. Didn't like what was going on. We have fights. Again, domestic students have this too. But and mixing domestic students or international students from other countries sometimes also has the same kind of tensions. Again, with food and religion, it's the same thing. So it's not always easy to find an appropriate, comfortable, for everybody living arrangement. All right, international background checks. What are all these background checks? What are they looking for? Well, they're looking for criminal history or ties to security threats. These are consular background checks, consular office at U.S. embassies, and sometimes the FBI are also involved. They look for criminal records. Are people on security watch lists? And there's additional scrutiny for students coming from different countries, like Iran, for instance. You have a closer inquiry, or to look at the field of study, depending on what they want to study. The consular background checks as another layer, an additional administrative processing for certain countries or those in academic fields that are sensitive. So all of that goes on. Then there's a SEVIS record review. It's not done. When students first come at the port of entry, that's usually at the airport, their first entry to the U.S., they are up to a port of entry screening where the Customs and Border Protection conduct a background check. And they look at all their travel documents. And SEVIS also has continuing checks throughout the stay. Anytime a student makes a change in their program, where they live, if they're transferring institutions, they all have to be reported immediately so that they can continue to study. Any failure to do so, you can lose your visa status and have to go back. Before I go to the next slide, let me talk about the fear of students having to go back. As I said earlier, many of these students are here because their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, everybody in their family has pooled their money to send them here. Failure is not an option. You don't go back to your home and tell your entire family, I wasted your money and I'm home a failure. I have had many students crying in my office who are facing some kind of academic difficulty because they can't go back. That's the stuff of which suicides are made of. It's a very tentative situation when an international student is in over their head to the point that they're going to be sent back home. They're accused of cheating or something along those lines. It's a very serious accusation. It's very, very serious. So that's an important thing to consider. All right. I hinted about this earlier. Why do international students, what do university students bring universities? Well, lots of things. But one of them is more money. And, universities are businesses. And so there is a difference. At Iowa State, here's your tuition fee. There's three structures. There's 3 levels. If you live in Iowa, this is your yearly tuition. If you live in another state, this is your tuition. It's quite a bit more. So if we have a lot of Illinois and Minnesota residents. It's quite a bit more. I might point out, though, that that is less than the in-state tuition in Illinois. I'm just stating. Okay? This is what international students pay. It's a little bit more than the non, but it is higher. They pay the highest. And in addition to that, international students don't get any U.S. federal aid. They pay full freight, and the university can benefit from that. They don't, as I said, they don't qualify for any federal or state aid. They pay the full freight. They help this extra money that goes to the university because of these students. It helps fund operations and programs and salaries and everything else. So a university wants to have a good balance, or at least some international students, for financial reasons, in addition to other reasons, again, of course. But it is an important aspect of a university's enrollment. So if international students aren't coming here, where are they going? A rising star is Australia. Australia has is moving up in the international student enrollment. It has the advantage of speaking English. It's an English-speaking country. And education is among their top 5 exports. And look at this. International students make up about 1/3 of all Australian university students. Remember, 6% here, 33% in Australia. So they're working really hard to grab these students. Now, they don't have that many because Australia is so much smaller. but that's a big competitor. Other competitors, Canada. Canada has always been a big competitor. United Kingdom. Both of these are English-speaking countries. Again, international students prefer English-speaking countries because English is the #1 foreign language taught around the world. But France and Australia are coming up. They also host additional international students. France attracts a lot of art students, business students. Australia, as I mentioned earlier. Germany. Germany and across the whole European Union, it's pretty low cost if you can get in. Surprisingly, Russia attracts a lot of international students, and especially from developing countries. And South Korea and Japan are emerging as well. So it's not that we don't have competition, we do. And it's just that these competitors, I think, are looking a lot better as our policies become more restrictive. So, again, policy changes, heightened scrutiny, new visa restrictions, expanded social media, sweeping Department of Homeland Security actions. You're aware that some Ivy League schools had their permission to enroll international students revoked for a short time, causing a lot of fear. Arbitrary deportations, threats to student status over political activism, and a specific targeting of Chinese students and those perceived as security threats. There's been large-scale policy reversals and lawsuits, and an ongoing uncertainty for current and incoming students. There's been no comprehensive congressional immigration reform this year. The most recent policy changes have resulted from executive actions and regulatory shifts. Presidential executive orders and agency policies that have mandated enhanced vetting of social media and digital footprints, and this also applies to current students who are renewing or extending their visas. So those that were here before these policies, they're still a part of that scrutiny. So it's caused a lot of anxiety among current international students. Fear of leaving, not being able to get back, losing their scholarships, being deported. There's been the result of a drop in applications. Universities, including Iowa State, has responded with support initiatives, advocacy, and legal advice. But of course, there's only so much that those institutions can do. There's been an economic and academic loss because international students do spend money, bring money, and help sustain our U.S. economy. The State Department has revoked about 6,000 international student visas because of violations of U.S. law and overstays. That's the language. The vast majority of these violations were assault, driving under the influence, burglary, and support for terrorism. Some students have protested in support of Palestine. And of the 6,000 student visas that were revoked, the State Department claims that 4,000 of those were revoked because the visitors broke the law. These things here. That's the story. There's also other effects. These are a little bit more indirect, but for instance, there was a USDA grant, $320,000 USDA grant that was canceled going to the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. This was not directly to international students. However, international students were being supported on that project. There's also been a broader decline in federal research, funding about 5% decline. And that also affects international students because many of these students are involved in these programs. They have assistantships that help support them. Remember, they had to have financial support showing for the first year. The hope and expectation is that they become involved in these other programs and have additional supports. When programs get cut, the students that are involved are also cut. Domestic students, it's bad for domestic students, but for international students, if that support is excluded, they may have to go back. So those students that are working in those grants, uncertainty, they have a visa challenge, they have to report that. And some have experienced some visa revocations. If they're OPT, they're on OPT, optional professional training, and that funding gets pulled, they also have to go back. The question I wanted to answer is, are there arguments in favor of limiting and closely scrutinizing international students? And the answer is, yeah, there are. It's not that every international student that we should open up our doors and say, y'all come. I mean, let's remember that there are some national security concerns. Remember that the September 11th attackers, they entered the US on student visas. Now, they overstayed their visas, but that's how they came in. So there is, there are reasons for some scrutiny, and we have to remember that. There is a risk of espionage and technology transfer. There are some people who will come here looking for that. So, the idea of having a program of some vetting is appropriate. It's a question of level and intent. I'm reminded in June 2014, there was an incident at Iowa State of a graduate student who was working with some motion control sensors, military grade technology, and he provided that information to China, and he pleaded guilty to smuggling and arms regulation violations and was sent back. So, I mean, it does happen. It happens across the country. It even happened here. At Iowa State, for instance, has a very intense program at the Ames lab. Iowa State is among an elite group of institutions and laboratories doing government work. So there are additional scrutiny that needs to happen if students are going to be affiliated with that level of work. And indeed, in certain programs that are Department of Energy and federally funded, there often are limitations into international student involvement. So there are some pros and cons. It's a question of level and intent. Another question we often hear are, do international students take the place of domestic students? When international students come, does that mean our Iowa students aren't being served? Well, the answer to that question is typically that's not true, at least not here. Let me use Iowa State again as an example. Iowa State has an overall acceptance rate of 88%. And you often hear at Iowa State that if students are qualified, they're accepted. They have the grades, the grade point average, and they're accepted. There aren't the same situations as we'll see in Ivy Leagues. But being accepted into the university is almost automatic for most students. Being accepted into some programs, sometimes there can be some issues. But if students want to come to Iowa State, for instance, and they're qualified, they get accepted. And they may have to wait a bit to get accepted into the major of their choice, but that almost always happens. There is a separate admission process for international and domestic students. They aren't all thrown together and we say we only can take a certain number. They're looked at separately. Iowa State is what's called a land-grant institution. It's an elite type of structure that means that it's dedicated to the state of Iowa. And so Iowa State and the University of Iowa, which is also land-grant, really wants to make sure that it serves the state. And it does so. So it's a flexible enrollment management. In other words, what happens at Iowa State is if we have 100 domestic students applying for a program in, let's say, biology, and they're qualified, all 100 come in. If we have 20 international students that want to come into biology, and they're qualified and have gone through the process, they too will be accepted. The biology department is going to figure out a way to serve those 120 students. It's not that there's slots. It's that we look at the number of students and then that program is expanded or made smaller depending on the number of students enrolled. That's how Iowa State, it's two separate pools. Iowa State is almost always looking for more students. It's not a process of eliminating. You know, Iowa State and University of Iowa takes pride in having the most students, right? They're not in a process of eliminating. So it's not that qualified students are being said no to make room for international students. It doesn't happen here. However, it does happen in some other places, like Harvard. Here, it does happen. Harvard is very small. Only 1,980 students are admitted last year, were admitted last year. 4.9%. 4.9%. There were 40,248 applications for Harvard last year, and they accepted only 1,980. The chances of getting into Harvard is very slim. And you can be sure of those 40,248, a lot of them were qualified. A lot of them were highly qualified. So everybody who's qualified doesn't get in. That's not like Iowa State, okay? International students at Harvard is 10.8%. Not that much higher than ISU. So typically they reserve around 200 seats for international students. Reserved. In other words, you know, were there 200 more students qualified to come, domestic students qualified? Yes, I'm sure there would be. But so, if those seats not been allocated to international students, 200 more American students would have been allocated. So, do international students take the place of domestic students? Places like Harvard, Columbia, NYU, Yale, Princeton, yeah, I guess they sort of do. But it doesn't happen in your typical university. Land grant here in Iowa. So what's next? Uncertainty. Policies are probably going to change. Possibly a chilling effect is going to happen as students choose other institutions. We can predict some ongoing legal battles and advocacy by universities. And Iowa institutions, like ISU, are at a crossroads. They're balancing compliance, support for global students, and maintaining international competitiveness. So that's the picture. Talked a little longer than I thought, but we have some questions.
Sure. How much time do you want to allow for questions? 15 minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes, Jan.
Thank you very much for gathering all this data. I remember several years ago when we were still doing more work at that time in Asia, that you said the first question parents asked was, is it safe? And is that still a reality?
Yeah, yeah. I had done quite a bit of work in Asia, and had talked with many parents. And you know what the question usually is? Is it true that all Americans carry guns? That's usually the way the question's worded. Yeah, yeah. They do worry about safety, and reasonably, for good measure. Yeah. Yes, Carolyn?
Okay, you dealt a lot with China. Does
Yes.
China have graduate schools now?
Oh, yes.
Have they developed?
Oh,
Are
yes.
they doing those ones that are not going abroad now? Or
Okay, let me explain something that I think not everybody understands.
Okay.
We think that the international students that are coming here are the best that the world has to offer. It's not true. They're the second best. In China, for instance, there are excellent universities in China. And the best students compete to get there. And the acceptance rate is like Harvard. It's like Harvard. And so the majority of students can't get into those institutions. Good students, but not good enough according to the universities. That's who comes here. That's who comes here. Yeah. Ann?
What percentage of students do you think over the years who've come actually end up staying on a permanent resident status?
I don't know the exact number. From anecdotal and from my own experiences, I'd say at least 3/4. At least, again, I'm going to tell you that I've never met a graduate student who really didn't want to come here. There were a couple, one or two, they wanted to go back to, they had a sick parent or something like that. But almost all of them wanted to stay.
And staying for both genders?
Yes, 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 yes,
Earlier, you talked about the agents being part of
yes.
this connecting process. I guess I think of them as like recruiters, like financial, like admissions has recruiters. But who pays those agents? Is it our Iowa State University or is it the international
Okay.
family?
It depends. The families always pay. The families always pay. Sometimes the institutions pay too. Iowa State does not pay. DMAC does. DMAC pays. And I didn't mention the role of community colleges in this, because they have a big role too. A lot of those students who can't make the English cut, or they have other issues that they can't get into like Iowa State, there can be a contingent acceptance, and they go to the community colleges, just like our domestic students do. And they'll go to DMAC. DMAC has a big English program. Go there for a year, and then come on back, and they will be accepted to Iowa State.
Yeah, that's true. I saw that a lot when I lived in North Carolina.
Yeah,
You'd get people with contingent acceptance at like Duke or USC, and they'd go to the local community colleges in North Carolina to learn English.
so that's another big road.
But then a follow-up on that, do our community colleges all over the state, do they have the resources with professional staff to both recruit and go through this, help the students go through this process and then work with them?
But some colleges do more than that than others. The problem with community colleges is that they don't have housing. So that's often an issue. But there are some community colleges that have a large proportion, because they also get that same tuition structure that I showed you. And that becomes an important aspect. Ann?
So I run a project at Iowa State where we have 20 graduate students, 18 of them are foreign. Does the university have any contingent plans that you know of if this enrollment decline, especially among graduate students, continues?
I don't know. I mean, that again, Iowa State is an institution that welcomes all students that are qualified. A drop in international students is a big financial problem because, again, they pay full freight. I would imagine that colleges are going to be looking more towards attracting students from other states I pointed out earlier that our out-of-state tuition in Iowa is less than the in-state tuition for Illinois. You can see billboards about that in Illinois. You know, so that may be something. But other than that, I don't know. I know that the International Students and Scholars Office is, you know, trying to do their best to keep current students comfortable and to continue attracting additional.
So are there universities in China or Australia or wherever there would be an attraction to American students?
Yeah, very few. You know, the flow is pretty much one way. I would say that probably our students would be more apt to go to France, for instance, to go to Europe. You know, they go for different reasons than to get a quality education. I mean, they might want, I shouldn't say quality, but they might want to, you know, study abroad, do other things. They won't go to China. They won't go to Russia, or there's very few. But, you know, perhaps the lure of some of the other countries might be. But I know as I was working in China, the Chinese universities say, well, can you bring us some students? Can we do some exchanges? That never worked very well. You know, we just couldn't find American students who wanted to live in, you know, it's a different country, it's a whole different system. If you've ever been in a Chinese dorm, I have, they're different. There's eight students to a room. You have 2 bunk beds, four levels on each side. The food is very different. Yeah. It'd be hard to convince some of our American students that this is the way to go. Yes?
Yeah, under the F1 visa, you talked about how the spouse or the recipient can't work.
Yes.
Can you kind of give a little bit more information on that and implications of that?
Yeah, well, you know, some students will bring their family. Married students bring their families, and indeed they can't work. And when they get their visa, they have to show that they can support, not only support themselves, they have to support their families as well. At ISU and in other institutions, they require, when you come, to show some kind of hospitalization or medical ability to pay should the spouse or children get ill, so that doesn't become a problem. But you know, many a spouse, as I said earlier, will just be supportive of their spouse, and often they'll be learning English or maybe taking a course or two at a place like DMAC. They can't be enrolled full-time though. They can just take a part-time class here and there. But all that costs money. And
Ames Public Library has free programs for international students and their families.
Thank you.
So there are free options out there.
yeah, but they're not credit bearing.
But they're not credit bearing and they're not like full classes.
Right. Right, and they can't work, part-time or full-time. They can't work. That's our laws.
Okay.
That's our laws. I don't know why.
Was it illegal to babysit in the 1970s?
Well, you know, I mean, of course, people work under the table type of cash payments, but legally, they can't work.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor.